Basically, we wanted to look into the vote in the 2016 election and try to analyze how people who are in the Hispanic diaspora, Hispanic Latinos, voted and why they voted that way. And we were trying to understand what the difference is between different Hispanic groups, not saying Mexican Americans versus Cuban Americans and Puerto Ricans and that kind of category, but by how they speak comfortably in English or not. So people who are English dominant, which means they probably don't speak a lot of Spanish or are not comfortable with their Spanish, is one group. Mm-hmm. People who are fluent in Spanish, whether they learned it here or are immigrants, is another group, regardless of how well they speak English. So people who are fully bilingual, we classify as Spanish. And then people who speak an indigenous language. And that's one of the fastest growing segments of the Hispanic diaspora. People who, for a lot of reasons, are coming to the U.S. In general terms, for example, one of the consequences of NAFTA was that it made food very inexpensive in Mexico. And as a consequence, there's been a tremendous impact on rural communities. So over the past 15 years, the number of people from Mexico coming to the U.S. have been from indigenous nations, Oaxaca, Puebla, Yucatan, Chiapas, that sort of stuff. Central America, because of the Civil War and the gang violence, you have a lot of people who are also marginalized, indigenous people coming to the U.S. as well. So the idea is, what happens to these people who are here, these groups of Hispanics, and because they come from Latin American countries, right, who are marginalized? They're marginalized because in their own countries, they were not in the mainstream just because many of them don't speak fluently Spanish. And in this country, they're assumed to speak Spanish completely well. So the thing is, they're doubly alienated. They don't speak English. They don't speak Spanish fluently. Right. They're marginalized on both levels. And these are the people who nobody counts. I mean, when back in 2010, there was a contention with the U.S. Census in New York City. The question was, how are you going to count indigenous-speaking peoples? At that time, the Census Bureau says, don't worry, we hired a Spanish PR firm that's going to help us. It was a disaster. Right. They undercounted tens of thousands of people who don't feel comfortable, don't trust speaking in Spanish. They didn't know what was going on or why they had to fill out these forms or answer these questions, and it just opted out by not participating. Right. So the same thing is, now we're looking at the elections. How does this impact? How did this portion of the population vote or not vote? Right. So what did you find? What's the finding? And then talk to me about the data breakdown and how you got to it. The finding is basically that the pre-Hispanic worldview and social organization is still impacting in how they live their lives here. So basically you have a situation where in a household, let's say there are 3 adults, 4 adults, whatever, and 2 are eligible to vote. Well, they decide among themselves over dinner in the kitchen who they will support. And then they send one person to vote. So it isn't one person, one vote. It's one household, one vote. Mm-hmm. And that's how they see it. That's one of the reasons why Hispanic diaspora participation is so low, because these individuals lower the turnout rate because they don't turn out. They turn out per household, not per person. That's one of the key findings. And the other key finding is that they look in terms of rewards and punishments. Are they happy with what's going on? And then they support whoever the candidate is for the party that's in power. And if they're not happy with what's going on, they want to punish the party that's in power. Right. And so basically in this case, they didn't care about Donald Trump. They just cared about the fact that Obama was deporting people and that Obama's successor would be Hillary. Right. So how do you get to that conclusion? What's the finding? What's the data? Tell me more about that. The thing is, the data is very difficult to get because you really have to get them at the workplace where they work, and you speak somebody who speaks some of their languages. Because once someone speaks Zapotec, someone speaks Quichemaya, someone speaks any of these languages, there's a trust there. And then you can simply say, are you doing this like you would do it in your village? Yeah. Oh, and how you do it in your village. Right? So it becomes conversational. And what you find is that these conversations are exactly the same when you go from one indigenous nation to another indigenous nation throughout. Basically, we're talking about the Mesoamerica culture area, which is south of the Valley of Mexico down to Nicaragua.
Right.
And that's where the indigenous-speaking nations from Latin America, primarily in the U.S., come from.
So what did you find? I mean, that's my question is in the executive summary.
What we found is that about 40% voted for Hillary.
40?
Oh, yeah. Of those people who voted, who were indigenous-speaking, only about 40% supported Hillary, which means 60% voted for Trump or one of the other candidates.
So how did you get to that number?
Well, we asked. We simply say, in this household, how did you punish the incumbent?
Okay.
Yes. So you voted against Hillary? Yes. We never asked you who you voted for, whether it was Trump, Stein, nobody, But that's how they voted. They've basically what we're saying is 60% voted to punish Obama.
Okay.
And voted against Hillary.
The question then is how, I guess, when you look at the executive summary, so you just went and talked to people, like what's the number? Like how can people understand this sort of like, because it is kind of a provocative finding. So how do you explain that to people in terms of sample size and how many people you talk to and all that, so that they can take this into consideration?
Well, throughout the 5 states, we spoke to 2,200 people.
Okay.
That's why it's taken us a little bit long, because we have to go back. And again, we do this all the time. So we go back to the same areas, the same people, not every day, but we go back. And, for example, a lot of the people in the New York area that we went to were the same areas that we went to in 2010 to talk about the census.
Okay.
So we have relationships with communities and say, oh, you're here, or your uncle is here, or your dad went home, that sort of stuff. So we see how the communities are changing. In Staten Island and Queens. I mean, sometimes you have to go to the workplace. Like, for example, people don't know this, but like, for example, on Park Avenue in Manhattan, okay, there's a cluster of restaurants, and a lot of the people who work in the kitchens are from the same family, same villages. So it's easy because there you can get a very good sense of feel for how their entire village, scattered throughout New York,
right,
thinks, acts, and voted. So that's how we can extrapolate from the samples that we follow. It's almost like when they do scientific tests and they want to see, they follow Julio for 30 years to see how his lifestyle affected his health.
Right.
Right? And then we were doing this to see exactly what's going on with the villages. There's something in Pennsylvania that's been around for like 40 years now, the Mexican Migration Project. They have wonderful research, and they've been tracking this for 40 years. So they know where all the communities are. They know all where everybody is, basically. And that's where a lot of the starting points for us when we began doing this 25 years ago started out.
So the takeaway for people who are following this is that what's the most accurate way to represent it? That 40% of indigenous-speaking Latinos, or how does chose Hillary?
Chose only 40% voted for Hillary. Of the native Hispanics, Latinos who speak a native language,
right, as their primary language,
right?
Okay, and how does that compare with an English-dominant Latino and a Spanish-dominant Latino that you found?
Well, well, it goes back to the other numbers that are pretty standard. I would say maybe 75 to 80% of Spanish-speaking Hispanics, Latinos, voted for Hillary.
Right.
And the ones who are Spanish-dominant, it's closer, or, it's like, I would say depending on the state, probably between 70 and 75.
Okay.
So
then the question in terms of the share, if you look at the whole, like, U.S. Latino population, how much does that break? I'm just trying to get some basic data down. How much is that? How would you categorize each group? Like, what's a percentage of indigenous-speaking, Spanish-dominant, English language?
Right. For us, see, that becomes much more difficult to report and to ascertain for one simple reason. It's easy to say, oh, here's a census, here's how many Hispanics, Latinos there are in the country.
Right.
Yeah, but how many are of voting age? Okay. How many are dreamers and can't vote, how many are undocumented and are in the shadows. So when you look at the actual number of Hispanics and Latinos who are U.S. citizens old enough to vote, it becomes very, very much different. And then we want to break it down by language. See what I mean? But what I can tell you, though, a very small percentage, only about 8% of Hispanics and Latinos who speak an indigenous language are eligible to vote.
How much is that again? 8, you said? 8%.
8. Which, not off the record, but that leads to suggest that 92% are undocumented or underage or on some kind of visa that doesn't allow them to vote. Right.
So you're saying it's like 8% of the indigenous indigenous speaking population in the United States can vote.
Right.
Okay. What is the share? I guess my question is, within that share, like how many are of those voters? How many? Of the 27 million eligible Latino voters, or whatever that fact is, how many of those are indigenous speaking?
Indigenous speakers?
Yeah.
About a good census figures numbers, and that we agree are comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
About only 17%.
17%. So why does this matter? Why do this? I'm not criticizing it. I'm just trying to get it. I'm just really curious. What it seems like it's a narrative that it's obviously a narrative that no one's talking about. So why does this matter? I know you guys mentioned in the executive summary, which I'll be able to share, but I wanted to get your thoughts on this recording.
Well, it matters for a lot of reasons. It matters, first of all, if you want to incorporate and reach out to the entire community in the Hispanic diaspora, you have to recognize that there are people who don't speak Spanish or English.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to understand, what do we need to approach these people? Second of all, it's what's in the head. If we're dealing with a population that's still clinging or thinking or working along lines of pre-Hispanic community patterns, is that okay? And if it's not okay, how do we educate them in a different way or reach out to them? So, for example, if you have 10 Hispanics who are eligible to vote, but they decide because they live in the same house or are part of the same family that only one will go and vote and speak for them, how do we impress upon them that that's how you do it in the old country, but here everybody can vote if you're eligible to vote, and everybody should vote, right?
Yeah.
So instead of having a family of 10 voting 1 vote for Hillary, if they all supported Hillary, it should be 10 votes for Hillary.
That's part of one of the reasons why that could be one of the reasons why
right.
When people say like Latinos don't vote, that could be a reason, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right. They don't vote individually; they vote as family units or as households.
Right.
Then the other important thing is, you can go to the Mexican government as an example, and they have a lot of information about who's here from where, because they provide a lot of services to their citizens.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't know this, but if you were born in Mexico, but in this U.S., regardless of your status, if you're a minor, you have free health care through the Mexican government. The Mexican consulate in New York has a clinic on premises.
Right.
You can schedule an appointment to see a doctor. All these sorts of things that are there. Now, there's a program called Paisano, Countryman. And the idea of that is to help people go back to Mexico. So the idea is these people are afraid and they're leaving, or they're being deported and they're leaving. Once they get to the border, there's a whole mechanism there of social services to saying, okay, where are you from? And they have people who can speak the various languages. Here's a bus ticket. This will get you to your town. It's going to take you 24 hours to get there on buses. Here's food.
Right. So, So I guess my final question is, like, how does this impact at all the national political discourse of how Latinos are represented in media, or why is this dialogue not happening? What do you think of the long-term consequences?
The long-term consequences are that whichever party's in the office or whichever party is courting Hispanics and Latinos, they have to have a much more nuanced approach, and they have to recognize that there are vast differences, and they have to understand what constituency they're going after and how to approach those people.
Mm-hmm.
For example, immigration, there's some Hispanic groups that have no problem at all with immigration. They were born here, they're Puerto Ricans, so they're U.S. citizens, they're Cubans, and they arrive and they're granted political asylum. So those 3 groups had nothing to do with immigration. They don't care about immigration, basically, unless they're empathetic to the ones who do care. Mexicans, Dominicans, everybody else, right? The ones who are here illegally. So you can't have one blanket position on immigration, because you have some immigration matters that don't affect any Hispanic, then you have some that are really, really life and death situations for another group of Hispanics.
Right.
See what I mean? And the same thing with how to vote and childcare and all these other issues affect different constituencies in different ways. So the idea is the more information you have and the greater understanding you have, it's not just, having, Tim Kaine speaking Spanish when his experience in Honduras is much different than a Cuban American's experience or Puerto Rican's experience. See what I mean? And how he, as an Anglophone person, may think he understands the Latino market. Well, he's probably very knowledgeable about the Central American situation. Right. But that has nothing to do with Puerto Ricans or Cuban Americans. Right. And it's okay if he knows that, but if he doesn't even know that, and he just assumes that all the Hispanics in the U.S. confront the same issues that the rural people in Honduras did when he was there. See what I'm saying? Right, but don't you think that the argument on the flip side, given the messiness that it is to be Latino in this country, that sort of shared commonality is also trying to be explored, not from a political standpoint, but from within the community itself? Yeah, but there are common issues, but there are also many more differences. Mm-hmm. So you have to figure out what holds us together and what holds us not together as a community, right? And figure out how does this extrapolate to a local situation, a state situation, and then a federal situation. Right, and they're all very different. And the last question I have, it is a fascinating topic, and it has me thinking a lot. So what you guys are concluding is basically, given Hillary Clinton's efforts with Latinos, that they didn't dig deep enough. Is that safe to say into understanding the community as well as they should have? Is that correct? And the thing is, for example, if you are a national political party and you have an office in every county, you have to figure out what's going on in your county, mm-hmm. and who the people are there, and then figure out what their needs are, as opposed to just being at the convention and having Julian Castro come and speak and just say a phrase in Spanish because he doesn't speak Spanish. Mm-hmm. I think you solved the problem. See what I'm saying? Yeah. It's like 25 years, 40 years ago, there were problems like this in Miami, where you had Americans who were sympathetic to the whole fact that they had a lot of Cubans there. They wanted to reach out to them. And I remember that there was one store that said they just went somewhere to the library and saw that the 26th of July was an important day in Cuban history. So on the 26th of July, they had a 26th of July sale. They're not realizing that that's exactly the Cuban Revolution. Right. So all the Cuban Americans were furious that these people were celebrating the Castro's revolution. Right. And here's someone who didn't know. They were trying to do something nice, and then just infuriating the consumers they were trying to reach. Right. Well, I appreciate your time.